Welcome to VLGA Connect. I'm Catherine Arndt and you're listening to the national broadcaster on all things local government.
Hello everyone, it's TGU time from VLGA Connect. So lovely to see you. Can I say you're looking very well today, as are my panellists that are joining me today. Tony Rownick, who's in Swan Hill. Hello, Tony.
Hey, Chris. Yes, up in beautiful, warm Swan Hill, where one of our dear friends, I think, of TGU and avid watcher, Steve Cooper, might have had his first role in local government, if I remember right, Steve. I
I
know
think
you've watched him.
that's what they call an old stomping ground, Tony.
Yes,
Oh,
there you
that's
go.
nice.
And Julie Reed's here. Hello, Julie. You're in Colac today.
I am, Chris. Yeah, it's probably not quite as warm as Swan Hill, but a little bit colder down here. But nice after all that heat that I've had in Gannawarra for the last few days. So nice to be out in a cooler environment.
Excellent. Good to have you dialing in from all corners of the state. I'm in the local government news roundup studio, which is in Lara, near Greater Geelong, as you may or may not be aware. So we've got a few municipalities covered with our locations today. What are we talking about today? Well, mayoral election results are all in. It's done for another year, and we'll talk about some notable outcomes there in just a moment. And Rhys Thomas has some fascinating stats and observations from the process of electing mayors and deputy mayors this year. The parliamentary report into local government funding in Victoria is out. It's come out today as we record this, with 48 recommendations to get our heads around. Criticism of the increasing use of municipal monitors in the past few days. Yarra City Council's 36-point omnibus motion has passed. We flagged that last week. They had a marathon 5-hour session. We'll talk a bit about that. And should 16-year-olds be able to vote in council elections? Yes, that's on the agenda again, this time out of Western Australia. So hopefully we'll have time to talk about all of that. But Julie, Tony, mayoral elections are done, all 78, because of course Moira hasn't gone to election and is under administration. Observations from the election of the mayors and deputies as a whole, Tony?
Look, I think probably a theme was a move more towards having deputies, those kind of regional councils and rural councils that perhaps hadn't in the past. We still have a few persisting without. Golden Plains, Horsham, Loddon, I think Pyrenees maybe don't have a deputy, but councils that in the past have not, like Hindmarsh, Yarra Swan Hill, Central Goldfields, they've moved that way. So there's one thing there that I think we'll probably see progressively more of with this, obligation for mayoral and deputy mayoral training and just a greater advocacy role for councils in maybe it's to do with being in a term where we're going to have a Commonwealth government election. Before or by May of next year, and state government elections in November of 2026. So, a real role for the leaders of the council to be sort of forthright in their advocacy to those other levels of government in the lead up to an election.
I know Rhys will have some thoughts on that deputy mayor thing. There are less councils choosing not to have a deputy mayor this time around, as you've picked up on, Tony. Another one, Julie, that I noticed, I don't know if there's any science to this, a lot of mayors coming back after a 2-year break. So they were mayor 2 years ago. They're back in the mayoral chair this time around, perhaps because of experience when we've had a lot of new councillors elected.
Yeah, I think so, Chris. And I think it's because of the new obligations that are placed on the mayor, to be the captain of the councillor team, to take on extra duties around that leadership, managing behaviours. And so I think that there's been a natural progression towards, getting more experienced councils back in and putting them back in that seat. They've had a chance to have a break. So they're feeling a bit more refreshed, and now they're coming in and taking on that role in the first year to try and make sure that the first year is quite stable. So I'm not surprised to see that. And some councillors that have been mayor multiple times as well, which is great. So interesting. It would be interesting to get their feedback about how they've responded to the mandatory training for mayors and deputy mayors, whether they feel that that's been worth it for them, they've picked up new skills, etc. Be interesting to hear what their thoughts are about around some of them obviously being forced to have that training.
I don't think we've got any really young mayors this time around. A couple of years back, we had a few. I know we've got a 20-year-old deputy mayor at Glen Ira, the youngest deputy mayor in that council's history. But perhaps to Tony's point before, councils sort of choosing experience, incumbency going into this period of time where advocacy is so critical, that perhaps has been playing on the minds of councillors.
Yeah, I think so. I think that's a good observation, Chris. And I think, as I've said before this week to councils, unique opportunity if you're an elected councillor this term to face, those elections at those two levels if you're in Victoria, and that's the best time to secure promises funding for your municipality, and we really need to be, ready to have with our priority list and our narrative around our, advocacy for council.
Don Henderson has been elected mayor at Hepburn, and he's the longest serving councillor on that council. I'm pretty sure I'm right in saying has been mayor before, and you've got to go back away to find when he was mayor. Not sure if you've got to go back as far as Stretch Contel at Greater Geelong, who is back in the mayoral chair after being off the council for 9 years, but he was mayor back in, I think it was 2012, 2013, something like that. So perhaps a couple of records in play there.
And I believe Stretch resigned from council, at that
That's
point,
right.
rather than wasn't re-elected. So it seems that he's come back and thoroughly re-endorsed, if you like, by the other members of the team and taken straight back into that leadership role.
So with your permission, Tony and Julie, I thought we might pause and go to Rhys Thomas's segment a little bit early this time around, because it's all about the process and the observations of the processes that have been used to elect mayors and deputy mayors this time around in Victoria. We're going to wing our way over to VLGA Central now, where Rhys Thomas is waiting for us. Hello, Rhys. How's your week been?
Very well, Chris. How about yourself?
Not too bad at all. Can't complain. It's been warming up a little bit, hasn't it? I know you've been spending your time going through some stats that you want to share with us this week. I've been thinking about, as we've come to the end of mayoral election season, what the gender balance is. We'll come to that in a moment. But what other interesting little things have you noticed from the election of mayors this cycle?
Yeah, well, I mean, it's clear that it's not just heating up in outside; it's heating up in various council chambers around Victoria.
Yes, very true.
There's a few things that I just find a little bit interesting, I suppose. I might raise a few of them. And we talked about briefly last week about that practice of not putting candidates to the vote after an absolute majority has been received. And, I think that probably comes from an eagerness to acknowledge and celebrate the outcome. Because I had a look at some of the governance rules of the councils that did that. And in all cases, the rules actually do require that the vote for the other candidate be put.
Yeah.
Doesn't affect the outcome, of course, but that was an interesting one. But I think
and that's what I would have expected. I think just perhaps in the heat of the moment, we've got the absolute majority, the deal is done. And I did mention the other one to you last week, where I noticed one council had a councillor call for a division on the mayoral vote, and they repeated it, and it was one of those cases where the first nomination was put and there was an absolute majority, and they didn't go any further. But I did see another one this week. I think it was Mount Alexander, where a councillor called for a division, and the CEO said, "No, we don't have divisions on mayoral votes."
Oh, that's good. I know, having been a governance officer for many years, there's this phrase that gets used occasionally, which probably doesn't get said out loud, and maybe I shouldn't admit it, but sometimes when there's a bit of a procedural hiccup, the CEO will say, "Don't worry, we'll clean it up in the minutes," which is
yes.
So maybe that's what happens.
I know you've noticed a quirky thing that I've commented on probably every year for the past 4 or 5 years now at Greater Bendigo, Rhys, where they announce a mayor and deputy mayor elect ahead of time and then confirm that in a formal sense, usually about a week later. What do you think of that?
I'm not a fan, because it begs the question, how was that decision made? Like, quite clearly, they've elected a mayor and a deputy mayor, and there's no doubt they've got the support of council, but that wasn't a public meeting. And the Act specifically says you need to elect your mayor at a public council meeting. And quite clearly, reading between the lines, they've done a straw poll and they know what the outcome of the meeting is going to be. And then at the meeting, they obviously do a formal nomination and election process. So it's all very legal, but it does make me wonder, are those councillors who go into that ceremonial meeting really going in with an open mind, or have they made their mind up? Because it's pretty obvious that they have. So I reckon Greater Bendigo would be well advised to have a look at that process and consider whether they should continue doing it that way, because I just don't think it's good governance in my view.
And I'm assuming it's still open to any of those councillors to perhaps change their position once it comes into the chamber for the vote, isn't it?
Technically, it probably is. And I'm sure the people at Greater Bendigo would say exactly that. They'd say, well, there's nothing legally wrong with it. It's done in order to, enable the incoming mayor to bring guests and do all the practical things. And there's media advantages in knowing who it's going to be. But I don't know. If you're one out from the rest of the sector, I think sometimes you've got to wonder why.
What else have you noticed that's perhaps a bit different to the way others do it?
Well, speaking of one out from the sector, I think Hepburn might be the only one that does it, and this one is unusual, but I really quite like it.
Yeah.
Is after they have the formal election, they make an announcement by a town crier on the steps of the town hall. It's the old-fashioned "Hear ye" announcement, and no doubt a few puzzled shoppers turn their head and wonder what all the fuss is about. And so at least the 10 people standing in the street that day in Dalesford got the news straight from the horse's mouth and found out who the mayor and deputy were.
Yeah, it's a nice quirky little touch, isn't it? There's been a couple of town criers around the sector over the years. I'm not sure how many are left. That could be the last one.
Yeah, maybe. Sure. I don't mind the odd town crier. It's kind of the old-fashioned live stream, isn't it?
Yeah, absolutely. Another thing that I've noticed, Reece, is the very small number of councils that choose to elect their mayor for a 2-year term. By my count, there's 3.
Yeah, I only found 3. And in fact, one of those, or maybe even 2 of those, actually elected their deputy for just 1 year. So there's a misalignment there.
Yeah.
I wonder whether that's an experiment that was inserted into the Local Government Act in 2020 to give councils more options. I wonder whether it's time to draw a line under that and say there's not really an appetite for it. With a handful of exceptions, most councils are going for the 1-year terms because, of course, a councillor can be re-elected. And the other thing is the 2-year term, it does come with it a slight poison pill, which is those 3 councils at Geelong, Shepparton and Indigo actually now have the power to cut short the term of the mayor through some sort of vote of no confidence as a bit of a procedure. Though that exists in only those 3 councils now. So, I don't know. I would just wonder whether it's time to say, well, look, we tried it and people didn't want it.
And it's interesting, 2 of those, Greater Shepparton and Indigo, have re-elected the same mayor for a 2-year term as last time. So 4 years in total. And I'm not sure, Shane Sarley might have even been in the role at Greater Shepparton prior to that previous term. But there's certainly some stability that comes with doing it that way, isn't there?
Well, maybe, but there's nothing wrong with having a dynasty with checking in every year and re-endorsing the candidate.
Indeed, as
council
most
can do that.
Yeah, as most do. The seconding of nominations, Reece, we've noticed this is a bit different from council to council through the process.
Yeah, and I've been listening to you read out the all the names on Local Government News Roundup, and what a great job you've been doing, by the way. I don't know how you managed to get through those things without going cross-eyed, but anyway. And on a number of occasions, you've pointed out that some nominations have lapsed for want of a seconder.
Yeah.
And no council I've worked at has had a requirement for a seconder. And I know when I wrote governance rules at Yarra, it was contemplated and we decided against it. The idea of having to have a seconder for an election, to me, is a bit odd. I kind of feel that if a candidate wants to stand for office, they've got every right to test the strength of support for them by having their name put on the ballot paper effectively. And it is possible that the existence of that requirement could actually affect the outcome in some circumstances. Now, they're a bit far-fetched. So imagine you had a 5-councillor council and all 5 councillors wanted to be mayor and they all nominated themselves. Well, what would you do? You'd be stuck. Yeah. Now, if you did have a way to split the tie, you could deal with it. But anyway, It's just interesting, and I kind of feel like if someone gets nominated, even if they've nominated themselves, my view is they should be able to be voted for. If they don't have the strength of support, they'll be eliminated early, and you'll get on with it.
Yeah. So I didn't watch every mayoral election, but I did notice two where there was a nomination for mayor and it didn't get a seconder, or one might have been for a deputy mayor. But I did notice a couple of elections where there were like 4 nominations, particularly for deputy mayor positions. That took a while to sort out as they went through their governance rules process for that. It was a bit unwieldy.
Well, you've always got the old ping pong ball technique for pulling the names out. And I remember when I first took on a governance role, my predecessor told me the urban myth about the trick with the ping pong balls. And I don't know if you know this one, but what you do is you have a word to the CEO beforehand about which person you want to be eliminated, and you pop their ping pong ball in the fridge. And then when you put them all in the bucket, the CEO just can reach in and pull out the cold one.
No, I hadn't heard that story.
I don't know if anyone's actually done it, but it's a good idea.
It is. We've seen a shift back to having deputy mayors this time around too, Reece. I noticed last year, I think it went the other way. There were about 6 or 7, I forget the actual number, that chose not to have them. And I thought at the time it was a reaction to the new act, which introduced an additional allowance for deputy mayors, particularly those smaller councils with very tight budgets.
I think that's probably right. And I've counted a few. Let me see them. There's Central Goldfields, Colac, Otway, Glenelg, Moorabool, Northern Grampian, Swan Hill and Yarra Ambiac have all gone back to having a deputy mayor this year after not having had one before. So I suspect that's probably a response to the new role for the mayor and deputy in resolving councillor conduct disputes.
Right.
The idea that perhaps you can share that role, or that you need a deputy in the event that the mayor is involved in that. And probably just more generally related to the rising workload for councillors. So I think there's only 5 councils now that didn't have a deputy mayor this year, and it'll be interesting to see if any of those make the jump next year.
And you also picked up on something, an unsuccessful mayoral candidate almost never then factors in the deputy mayor election that immediately follows.
Certainly. I mean, I haven't done any measuring of this, but just hearing the names and hearing how proceedings went, I'm not actually aware of an unsuccessful mayoral candidate who then goes on to be elected as deputy mayor. So it's sort of like whoever's second place doesn't automatically get to be the deputy. And I was thinking about that, and I wonder whether it's because if you've got a council that's perhaps split and there's 2 different factions in it, then each vote, the one for the mayor and for the deputy mayor, can be dominated by that dominating faction. So they can choose who they want. And so that the other side, if you want to use that language, will always miss out. So I don't know if it's a good thing or not. There's some value that says having the mayor and deputy of like mind is actually a value. There's another argument that says, well, the diversity of opinion in that leadership team might be better. So I don't know, other than changing the law about how the deputy and mayor get elected, then that's just how it's going to be.
Interesting one. I hadn't thought about that. Where are we sitting gender-wise with the mayors around the state?
Well, you remember we talked about the 43% for all of councillors and how we didn't move the dial on that. I don't know what the dial was before the election for mayors, but it is slightly closer. We have 35 women mayors, which is 45% of the total. We also have 35 women deputy mayors, and that's a slightly higher proportion, 48% of the total, because there's less deputies. But so we're not at 50-50 for either group yet. But for deputies, I think probably if one vote had gone the other way, we might have gotten it. But yeah, there's still work to do. The numbers obviously of mayors and deputies are much smaller. So, there's a little bit more sort of margin for error, I guess. Yeah. But yeah, we nearly got there. But it's not surprising that if we only had 43% of people who could be mayor are women, then it's not surprising that the number who did become mayor was not far off that.
Before we let you go, you broke a story here last week that's got a bit of attention since, and that is some issues with the swearing of oaths and affirmations. And I even heard, and I've not been able to confirm which council it is, that one actually went through the process of re-electing the mayor because there'd been an issue with some of the swearing of oaths of those councillors, and they obviously wanted to make sure that was all done appropriately. What are your thoughts, having had some time to reflect on that, Reece?
Well, I mean, the story about the mayor being re-elected is interesting, and if that has happened, we'll know that in due course, because that'll have to be a public meeting with minutes, etc.
Yeah.
But what we know since last week is that local government inspectorate has written to CEOs and asked them to sort of confirm that the process was followed correctly. And from what I understand, there's quite a few councillors around the state that, out of an abundance of caution, have retaken their oath or affirmation. But and that's all great, and it's good that it's happened. But the concern I have actually is how this whole issue came to light, which was, I discovered it. I just happened to be watching the live stream of a council meeting, and I noticed these errors being made in real time. So that triggered my reaching out to the inspectorate to say, oh, what advice can I give this council? Do they need to re-swear and retake the oath or affirmation? And that's what's sort of started the process. Now, given we sort of got into a not dissimilar situation not that long ago, where oaths and affirmations were taken incorrectly, and I think the issue was entirely foreseeable. We talked about it here on the panel, and surely it shouldn't have relied on me happening to watch that meeting to pick it up, because what if we discovered after the deadline for re-swearing in had passed? We might have actually had to have by-elections at enormous cost. So yeah, that's a shame that I'm glad that we've found it. It's awesome, but it's a shame that it was more by happenstance than anything.
Well, kudos to you and the VLGA and the resource that got provided. I've heard anecdotally to councils, those governance insights had been very, very useful and were followed by some councils that didn't have an issue, Reece. So big tick there. But, all of this also just confirms the rather pedantic view that we often present, and people say you're just being, way too bureaucratic. Process matters. Processes are there for a reason.
And look, they should make our life easier. I'm not all one for creating process for its own sake, but at the end of the day, we don't want some council having to stand up in a court somewhere and justify whether or not its decisions are legitimate. It's so much easier if you can point to the piece of paper and settle the matter once and for all.
Well, and we had a case a few years back where they had to change the legislation to deal with the problem that had occurred. So some of us still feel that quite acutely. Thank you, Reece. Fascinating as always. Look forward to chatting with you again next week.
Yeah, or maybe I'll be back. I'm beginning to stretch the friendship with my puns. I reckon maybe I've got one or two more left in me.
Sounds like someone's angling for a holiday. It might be ready to take a break. All right, Reece, we may talk to you next week. Thanks again, as always, for your insights here on TGU.
No worries. Thanks, Chris.
Thank you to Reece Thomas. Not sure whether we'll see Reece again this year. There was just sort of giving us a little bit of hint there that maybe he's running out of topics. We'll see. All right, Tony, Julie, some other stuff that's been happening, which is pretty interesting, is the parliamentary inquiry report out today into the sustainability of local government in Victoria, funding in particular. 48 recommendations. I've got to say, I haven't had time to read this yet, other than the high-level stuff. Julie, you've had a look. What's your initial impression?
I've had a quick look, particularly at the findings and the recommendations, Chris, and this is great stuff, I've got to say. I mean, this is really playing into the beneficial hands of local government. There's some really strong recommendations in there from this report. Particularly, I'm loving the recommendations around cost shifting. There's also things in there about bringing back the planning flying squad for rural councils. There's a lot in there about the sustainability of rural councils going forward and the need for the government to help councils. There's some great examples in there around where they're saying the government should provide 50-50 split funding in relation to school crossing supervisors. And we've spoken about this issue. This is one of my passions, about how that funding has whittled away over a period of time and needs to be back in balance between the state and local government. There's also lots in there about, councils and that recovery from those extreme weather events and the financial sustainability based on that. So there's some really great recommendations in there that I think local government are going to be very happy about. Some of them very, very specific, some of them targeting state government generally, some of them targeting local government Victoria for what they need to do. some of them targeting the Grants Commission. So I think this is worthy of a good read by councils and to absorb what it is. So my understanding, Chris, is that the government now need to respond to this report within 6 months as to what they're going to do. So there's time for us to digest it, and I think maybe worthy of a bit more of a discussion at maybe a future session.
Just before I get Tony's take on it, Julie, you're an ex-ED of Local Government Victoria. How did the recommendations in relation to that body sit with you as someone who sat in that chair?
Yeah, I mean, I think they were very palatable and I think they were reasonable. I mean, they were things that I think would be expected, like, making sure you engage with local government genuinely, when you're looking at changing the legislation, for example. Yeah, well, that should be what they're doing. So there was nothing in there that I was surprised about from that point of view, and nothing that I would think that Local Government Victoria would necessarily be too disturbed about, I think. So yeah, it'd be interesting to get their take on it.
Yeah. Okay. Tony, any initial thoughts?
Yeah. Well. Firstly, I mean, this is a report coming out of the Legislative Council, so the upper house of the Victorian Parliament, where it's the Legislative Assembly that decides who's in government. So it remains to be seen how the Victorian government respond to this. It's off the back of some great sort of advocacy and representation by various CEOs, councillors, representative bodies that came in and spoke to those Legislative Council members who formed this inquiry. I agree with Julie, some really interesting points. I was struck by the point that federal black spot funding currently, 9% of the funding, and the federal black spot funding is there for, to upgrade road intersections, was taken by the state government in, admin costs, 9% of that $2 million. All these recommendations will be hailed, I think, by anyone with an understanding of local government. Things like, a 50-50 share on the public library funding, a return to, a guarantee of 1% of Commonwealth tax revenue, a set date or set month for the payment of the Commonwealth financial assistance grants to help with, budgeting and cash flow at council. So some really valuable things. I think there are, a good set of dot points for us to be now, urging action by the state government. But we've had so many of these sort of cost shift reports over the years, Chris and Julie, haven't we? So, what we really want is action on this, and even if we can see, if we're going to keep rate caps, at least if the rate caps are based on reality around real costs for councils, and part of this report comes down to what comes out is that a recommendation that those rate caps should take into account real costs to councils, wage rates in the sector, construction costs, these sorts of things which currently don't seem to be being taken into account when this arbitrary rate cap figure is announced. At, again, not at a set time every year, so we have to wait in hope and wonder. So, yeah, let's see advocacy by the sector now to state government to see that they respond in kind to the report in some positive ways.
Yeah, so we must be getting close to this year's rate cap announcement.
Yeah.
I think generally it's just before the end of the year, isn't it?
Yeah.
So obviously the big one that councils want to see movement on is that rate cap model. Good to see that
That's
the
right.
review is there. And as you said, Tony, it's sort of loosely been based, I think, I stand corrected, on CPI, which is so far away from the typical costs of councils in delivering the services.
And I think, Chris, there was also a bit of a concern about the disproportionate increase for farmers and for business people as a result of the rate cap as well. And they're concerned about the impact that that's having in terms of the amount of increase in rates for those businesses, which is interesting.
Okay. So the VLGA has put out a statement today. First cab off the rank, I think, in terms of the peaks responding. Catherine Arndt said she's delighted with the recommendations that have come out of this report, very much in line with the presentation that Catherine gave on behalf of the VLGA to the inquiry back in July. She said, and I quote, "It's pleasing that the findings of this inquiry have recognised the support Victoria's 79 local councils need in order for them to be able to deliver essential services, support local communities, and plan effectively for the future." I guess it's now next steps. Let's see how the government responds. I'm not sure what history tells us about how effective these sorts of reports have been in terms of delivering actions. We just wait and see. So the report there is on the committee's website. As Julie said, I think we'll probably come back and talk a bit more about this in the weeks ahead as we and the sector get the time to digest it. While we're sort of on politics, Peter Walsh, the now former leader of the Nationals, has just stepped down, as you're probably aware. But just before then, he made a statement as the spokesperson on local government about the use of municipal monitors in councils across Victoria. He's called this a growth industry. He's called into question the ability for councils to be funding $1,300 and something a day plus expenses for each of those monitors. Tony, fair criticism?
Yeah, look, I think whilst monitors have done some good work across the sector, it is another burden on some of those councils, and you know, when multiple monitors are sometimes being appointed, if they're both present at the same time, I guess the cost can potentially double. It is very significant. A very significant sort of cost on councils where they're there for generally at least 3 months, often 6 months, sometimes more. And so I think it's right that there should be scrutiny. I think also, frankly, I think there's a range of quality in monitor reports. I would say in terms of the depth of content in reports and the depth of analysis in reports, and so I think that the public and those local communities sometimes deserve a lot more from the monitors, certainly in terms of some public transparency. What are they delivering? And there are some can I say, some real exceptions to that, some really high quality reports that I've read that are going into great detail, but some seem quite cursory in their summation of, what's been achieved at council.
Yeah. Given that most of the monitors have similar remits, it's usually around, governance processes, councillors' involvement in those processes, and the dealings that they have with each other. Should there be some sort of minimum output standard for municipal monitors to be delivering so that there's an expectation on what it is going to provide?
Yeah, I know that they're reporting to sorry, Judy, but I know they're reporting to the minister. But I think there's also an obligation, given that it's being paid for by the local community through their rates. I think there's an obligation for some transparency there. And, a 1.5 or 2 page report where one page is just repeating the terms of reference that were published when they were appointed doesn't cut it for me.
Yeah, I would agree, Tony. I think there needs to be a consistency. There needs to be more detail for the communities to understand what's going on. It's no use doing it behind closed doors. For the minister, the community needs to know what they're getting for their money. So I would agree with that as well. I think that some of them are a bit light on, and they need to, the communities and the council needs to have more detail in some of those reports. So I think it is, maybe again, this is a model that should be where it's imposed upon local government. Maybe there should be a 50-50 split, of covering the costs of the monitor, as per what has been recommended in this report that we've just seen. Maybe some of that should be worn by the government to assist the councils. I don't know. That could be one way of potentially dealing with it. But look, I think there's benefits in having monitors, but we want a good solid job from all of them that is consistent. You're right.
Sorry to chuckle, Julie, at the 50-50 comment. I agree with the sentiment. I just think it's highly unlikely that
Probably, but you know, you can
that,
always have wishful
that
thinking,
would happen.
Chris.
And at the risk of sounding like the president of the John Watson fan club, I do often hold up the Watson report from Darebin as being, I think, a gold standard for a municipal monitor's report. The depth, the rigor, the analysis contained in that report, I think is something all of the others should look at.
Yeah, I'm not too sure whether it's the doubling up of payment is happening though. I think that what they're doing is they're only having one monitor at any one time. So, and I think it's if you've got a monitor or two monitors that are assigned for 2 days, they share that time. So I don't think it's doubling the cost. Yeah, which is an interesting to note that, I think.
That's important. Absolutely. All right, a couple of councils in the news this week. One is Bayside Council, where a very popular local Christmas display has been cancelled. They've blamed the council for red tape costs, traffic management, etc. The council has said that they've been working with the organisers to try and make sure this goes ahead and haven't asked for anything that they haven't been provided in previous years. I know this is sort of your neck of the woods, Julie, if you're familiar with the event.
I know, and it's Christmas, Chris. It's like Christmas always gets local government in trouble in some way, shape or form. And there's always something in the media about, you know, the Grinch at Christmas, or, you know, the council who has, you know, put too much burden on the ratepayers around Christmas time. And anyway, this one was a little bit caught up in red tape requiring, but we're talking about I think a property which, you know, is getting thousands of people coming through each year, and they're worried about the traffic management in that situation. And, you know, it's only going to be one person that gets hurt, where the council are going to be responsible for, you know, for that because it's on their public road. So I can understand a bit from the council. They want to work, they want to support it, they want to work with the residents, but it's becoming very costly for the residents to do this.
Yeah,
you know, I can understand that, but Christmas, it's always so controversial, isn't it?
Look, putting my ex-mayoral hat on, I'd be, you know, if I was the mayor at Bayside, you know, I'd be convening some. Let's all sit down with the officers and the organisers and see if we can solve this. I mean, this event's been occurring for the last four years or so. It raises money for breast cancer research, I think up to $70,000 or more so far. I absolutely understand there needs to be traffic management. There are probably insurance elements here potentially if there's public land affected, but these are the sorts of things that the community remember, that are symbolic to the community, meaningful. And I know the council's just been elected there, but it's an early conundrum, and I'd be you know, trying to get parties together, talking about is there a way to salvage this before it gets too close to Christmas.
And I'm sure that's happening behind the scenes.
Yeah,
Tony.
I would say that as a result of this publicity, that something is going on in the background now to try and resolve it, I suspect. Yeah.
Let's hope, fingers crossed, that there can be an outcome that everyone is happy with there. Who watched Yarra City Council's meeting this week on Tuesday night? No,
but I've heard about it.
5.5 hours.
Have you got a life, you two? My goodness.
No way.
I must confess, I didn't watch it. I was getting text messages during it. It did go for more than 5 hours. I've looked at some of the clips since. This is that 30, it depends on where you read, 35 or 36 point motion that was put up by the new mayor there, Stephen Jolly, and the independents who are now in control of Yarra Council to undo a whole range of things that had been decided in the previous term by the Greens-led council. I'll point you to a clip on The Age, which is a 6-minute section of the meeting where the last mayor, Edward Crossland, criticises the process that's used here. He describes it as bad governance. Steve Jolly responds and says he's not going to be lectured by the Greens on bad governance and that it was necessary to clean up, I'm paraphrasing here, the mess that was left behind by the previous council. You can sort of see the various views here, and you know, I'm always going to fall back on process, but it's gone through with a 7-2 vote. Big job now for the administration to put into action all of these 36 points.
And I think the point that was made, which is interesting, Chris, was about it being on block. So the councillors had 3 minutes each to speak on 32 items that were in one sort of notice of motion. So they were saying, well, is this really tantamount to being on block? And is that against what came out of the Operation Sandon report about not dealing with these issues,
Yes.
multiple issues on block? So I don't know whether Tony's got a view on that, but I think that I have some sympathy towards the councillors who wouldn't have had the opportunity to debate each one of them fully.
Yeah, no, look, no doubt from a governance and public transparency perspective, there's some real limitations in rushing all these things through in one motion. I dare say the current majority there at Yarra Council and the Mayor Stephen Jolly would say, we've been elected with a strong mandate here, and I suspect that's true to do these things, and I believe that there was a large public gallery in support. Not that that's necessarily determinative of the public view, and I'm sort of admiring from afar the get down to business approach that they've got, that group. But from that perspective of governance, clearly very limited opportunity for individual councillors to respond, for the public to get their head around some of these things, and now indeed for the executive teams needing to act on, presumably on a whole series of matters. But this is at least a mayor that appears to have hit the ground running with a clear agenda, certainty of what he and his team want to achieve, and they're moving forwards. But I would have recommended it be done in a different way, but we clearly know the direction they're heading.
Yeah, I would agree with that, Tony. I think one of the reasons the meeting went so long is there were a lot of members of the public speaking as well, which required the forbearance of all that were present. So yeah, interesting times at Yarra. We'll keep an eye on what happens next. Are there other issues that are in the pipeline to be dealt with that might be seen as reversing previous positions of the council? We'll wait and see. Okay, let's just head across to Western Australia briefly, where this caught my eye this week. The Children and Young People's Commissioner there, her name is Jacqueline McGowan-Jones, has recommended in a report that 16 and 17-year-olds be allowed to vote in council elections, really as a way of getting them to get their feet wet in the election system before moving them into state and federal. We've had this raised before, I think, out of New Zealand. Julie, what are your initial thoughts?
Yeah, I mean, I actually like the idea, Chris, because I think that 16 and 17-year-olds nowadays have access to so much information, and they also, have really strong opinions. And so I think we should allow them to participate in that process, because a lot of the services that are delivered by councils, intersect with the youth. So I think that having a say at that age is not a bad idea, and it gets them ready for and connected to councils and what councils do earlier on. So I'm actually in favour of this one. I don't know whether I was in favour before. I can't remember, but I am in favour now. I think I think it's probably worth testing, and I hope that it happens.
I remain I don't like this idea, I've got to say. Look, right. I love the idea of engaging youth in civics and these things, but I do think that they're not ratepayers. They're too young to own land. Their connection to that local government, sure, they do consume services. I agree with that, but I do think that there is an element of you pay for those who pay to support local government should have the greatest say. I just don't think we're the level of government this should start at, but and I suspect it's not going to go anywhere. Can I predict that?
Yeah, well, that's what happened in the UK, I believe. Sorry, it was the UK. It says it at the bottom of the story. The new Labor government there campaigned on a promise to lower the age to 16, but has not made it a priority in its first year. So it's still there, bubbling away, but not acted upon.
It's all the adults that don't want the teenagers to have any control.
Quite possibly. I chuckle too, Julie, that you can't remember what your position was on this before.
No,
but,
I can't.
But you think you might have changed your mind since then.
I think I've changed my mind, and I think that's because I've got a 15-year-old boy, and I've seen him and see how much that he absorbs and how much of an opinion he has on things. And I think that probably from that experience, I've shifted my position on it potentially.
Fair enough too.
So, Chris, the last time, and Chris and Julie, this came up, I think my observation was I'm looking forward to, the councillor standing up in the council meeting saying, we have to end now. I've got to get home. It's past my curfew, or I've got to do my homework. The meeting better end soon. That sort of thing. I'll get in trouble with mum if I'm not home soon.
Well, that might happen.
Look, I think, it's really funny because there are some councils that have these programs where they have junior mayors.
Yes.
And these are kids that are, pretty junior, and, the value add that they bring and what they learn throughout the year. I think that program is fantastic. I'm a big fan of the junior mayor program to get kids to understand democracy and understand good governance really early on. I think that's fantastic. So, 3 cheers for the young people.
While we're on the subject of young people, I just want to give a plug to a new initiative that's come out of the VLGA. It's called the VLGA Young Councillors Network. And the VLGA is inviting councillors who want to connect with other like-minded people in the sector. This is open to all Victorian councillors under the age of 40. You'll receive access to professional development and training and have the opportunity to network and share ideas with your peers. The VLGA is looking for you to signify whether you're interested in being part of this. You can register via the website, vlga.org.au, or you can email vlga@vlga.org.au. And it's free for councillors from VLGA member councils. That's a nice initiative there.
Yeah,
Nice
I like that. I like that
thought.
approach. I think that's a really good program, Chris. It'd be really interesting to hear how it goes and how they connect with each other and what kinds of things they participate in. I think it's a great initiative. So well done to VLGA.
Yeah, I think when you're on council and you are in your 20s or 30s, you're typically, in a minority. You may well be the only councillor, but you're in a small group on your council, and no matter how embracing and inclusive the other older councillors are, you may feel somewhat out of in the sense of you think differently, you do things in a different way. You're more you're inclined to you're more digitally competent in a lot of ways, and being able to then coalesce with a group of people in local government who are facing similar issues, and how do we take this to our perhaps our somewhat older colleagues and convince them. I think that there'd be some real value in that. But look, I don't. Clearly, Chris, Julie, and myself, if we ever run for council, we're not going to be part of this group.
Quite the opposite, I think.
Let me make it really clear. I'm never going to be running for council, Tony.
I second that emotion.
Been there, done that.
Yeah, that's right. Yeah.
All right, before we wrap up, I just want to drop one more story in the mix. We don't need to talk about this at length now, but this has just dropped this week as well. Down in Tasmania, they've been conducting what's been called the once-in-a-generation review of the local government sector. The government's report has been released this week, and it is not going to result in any forced amalgamations. It is not going to result in any staff reductions. It's not going to result in any service improvements, and it's not going to result in any rate cuts. So you might ask, What will it result in? Well, the government will support voluntary amalgamations between councils, and it's going to release a discussion paper within the next 10 weeks to further explore reform options. I'm at a loss to understand what the reform options are going to be, but maybe we wait for that discussion paper and then we can discuss it a bit more.
It sounds like it's going to result in nothing.
It does sound like it's not going to result in very much, Tony.
Yeah, I think there's been attempts at voluntary amalgamations, but they've often sort of got partway through a process and it's fallen over. Not, you know, if we relied on that process in Victoria, we'd still have the 200 odd councils, wouldn't we, that we had in the Kennett era.
Yeah, very true. Very true. And you're right. There are still a few on the cards in Tasmania. Some voluntary amalgamations being proposed, which we'll know more about once this discussion paper comes out about how the Tasmanian government may support those processes. I've got to say though that the Local Government Association of Tasmania has come out and said it is satisfied with the outcome. So there you go. Councils are happy, apparently. All right, let's wrap it up for another week from TGU. Tony, thank you very much. Enjoy the warm weather.
I shall, and back home in Doreen tomorrow night, and
very good.
On the road again next week.
Safe travels, and Julie, you're on the road too, so safe travels to you.
Yeah, I'm on the road tonight back to Melbourne, so and thankfully no big storms on the way home, so that's good because the weather's been a bit patchy, hasn't it?
It has indeed.
Yeah.
All right, great to catch up with you as always, and we look forward to seeing you again next week when I'm sure we'll have lots more to talk about from this big, wide, wonderful world of local government. That's TGU from VLGA Connect, brought to you by the wonderful team, I've got to say that because Tony's sitting here at Hunt & Hunt Lawyers. Until next time, thanks for watching and bye for now.